Aden, People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, November 22, 1984. On a garrison parade ground behind a whitewashed colonial wall, a general who has run Army intelligence for 6 years takes his last review. He believes his most protected hour is the hour before he goes home. But at midnight, a written procedure will move his personal detail from an aide of 6 years to a captain of 3 weeks. And for the 4 minutes of that transfer, no one in the People's Armed Forces will legally own his life. A foreign service has spent 90 days watching him and 1 afternoon inside his ceremony. This is Operation Interlude. Welcome to Blueprint Watch with Mark. Subscribe if you follow how the great intelligence services turn a written procedure into a window nobody meant to open. November 22, 1984. Aden woke at 0542 hours to the call to prayer from the Ad-Herbal Mosque, and by 0612 hours the state daily 14 October was on the newsstands with a paragraph on page 3. The retirement of General Nasir Muhsin al-Audali, head of the Directorate of Military Intelligence of the Yemeni People's Armed Forces, would be marked that evening in the Ma'ala compound at 2000 hours. The paragraph was 9 lines long. The 9 lines had been settled the previous week by the party bulletin. The party bulletin had been photographed on that Wednesday, read at a desk in Tel Aviv on the following Tuesday, and passed the same afternoon to a small standing file that had been open since October 1978. At the general's residence at 14 Ma'ala Terrace, the corner house on a switchback street above the harbor, he took his morning walk with his aide-de-camp, Major Ali Saeed al-Dalii. The two men left the front gate at 0630 hours and turned along the shore road. To their left, the port of Ma'ala was already at work, dock cranes moving crates of Bulgarian cable drums and Soviet foodstuffs onto flatbed lorries. To their right, the volcanic wall of the Shamsan Massif rose 552 meters against a pale sky. They walked for 11 minutes, said little, took the same route they had taken most mornings for 6 years, and were back at the corner house by 0651 hours. The general's wife, Wahiba al-Audali, was on the veranda with the tea and the small dish of dates. She had been Wahiba al-Audali for 28 years. She said what she said most mornings, which was that the water pressure had failed again at the top of the terrace, and that the plumber would come after prayers. The general answered as he answered most mornings, which was that the plumber would not come. At the Ma'ala compound, the reviewing stand was being finished under a canvas tarpaulin against the sun. 3 flagpoles stood at the front of the parade ground. The flag of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen was in the center, the flag of the Yemeni Socialist Party to the right, the standard of the reviewed unit to the left. Along the back rail of the stand, bunting and party red had been strung the previous afternoon and had already tightened in the trade wind. At 0810 hours, a small blue Peugeot 504 with a Mala electrical shop stencil on the driver's door signed onto the compound gate ledger for a wiring inspection of the reviewing stand public address system. The driver was Nashwan Ali al-Sabri, the owner of a shop on the Ma'ala front called Al-Sharq Lil Kahraba. The paperwork he presented listed one sub-subcontractor, a Bulgarian audio-visual specialist supplied through the Texum State Labor Program, name of Konstantin Petrov, registered address the Bulgarian Workers' Compound on the Kormaksar Road. The corporal on the gate stamped both papers and returned them without reading the Cyrillic. At 0900 hours, the general took his second cup of coffee at his private office window. From that window, he could see the shore road and the west end of the compound wall. The wall was 3 meters high and painted white. Beyond it, the trade wind was moving the tops of the date palms at the corners of the reviewing stand. He had enlisted in 1954 as a private in the Federal Regular Army, the British officered force that then policed the Aden Protectorate. He had been 25 years old and from the al-Audali tribal country east of the peninsula. He had been commissioned in 1959, spent the early 1960s as a junior captain on convoy escort in the hinterland, and in 1966 had crossed to the National Liberation Front cadres in the Wadis north of Aden. He was one of the earlier crossings. When the Federation collapsed in 1967 and the National Front took Aden, he re-emerged as a regular officer in the newly formed Yemeni People's Armed Forces. He was 38. Through the 1970s, he moved along a standard Soviet pattern career. He took the higher officers course at the Frunze Military Academy in Moscow. He returned with a working Russian and the Soviet Order of the Red Star pinned once. He took a battalion, then a staff post on foreign liaison. Then in October 1978, he was appointed head of the Directorate of Military Intelligence. On the retirement day, it would be 6 years and 1 month. The Directorate was a real staff branch of the Yemeni People's Armed Forces. It sat under the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. In practice, it held 3 sections: signals collection and reporting, foreign liaison, and a small internal counter-espionage cell that duplicated the more powerful state security organization's remit and created friction between the two services. The foreign liaison desk was the one that mattered to services beyond Aden. It handled the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen's training courtesies to a range of Palestinian rejectionist groups, Ethiopian party formations, and, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, a rotating quantity of Cuban, East German, and Soviet advisors whose presence was legal, catalogued, and busy. He signed the standing agreements. He read the visiting officers in. He signed off the training rosters that put a certain number of European passport-holding men through certain camps in the Wadis for certain months. The foreign file at that Tel Aviv desk was, at bottom, the arithmetic of those signatures. It was 6 years old on the retirement morning. It had been read by 12 officers and rewritten by 4. He was not a public figure. He was on the reviewing stand at the anniversary of the revolution and at the party congresses, and his photograph had appeared in the state daily. 14 October in the sequence of 6 senior officers at a Damascus visit in 1982, and again at the Moscow visit of 1983. That was all. He was 55. He was tall for his generation. He had a scar on the left cheekbone from a 1964 convoy ambush, which the state daily called a wound of the anti-imperialist struggle. By 1983, the file's judgment was that the target's activity was not diminishing, and would not diminish under his named successor, Colonel Fadl Qasim al-Yafi'i, who was a protege rather than a rival. By the spring of 1984, the judgment was that a strike opportunity, if one arrived, should be taken inside the retirement window, before the successor's line closed and before the Directorate's foreign courtesies expanded further. By August of 1984, the retirement date was on the party bulletin, and the file was in front of a mission commander in the Cyprus station. 90 days is a professional courtesy in the pattern of life discipline. It is enough to see a target's ordinary weekday, his weekend, one visit from a grown child, one anniversary or funeral or promotion, and one weather turn. It is long enough to catch what a shorter watch will miss. On this file, the 90 days ran from August 24th, 1984 to the retirement morning. They were run by a case officer of 11 years' service with the invented name Ayelet Carney and the code name Red Wing. She had entered Aden on a French passport as a physiotherapist, attending a family in the officers' terraces above Ma'ala. She had rented the middle floor of a 1930s 3-story stucco house 4 doors up from 14 Ma'ala Terrace on the same switchback street. The house was pale ochre, the balustrade painted pale blue. Her landlord was a retired customs officer who spent his winters at his brother's farm inland. From her veranda, she had a clean view of the corner house's front gate, of the general's morning walk turning down the shore road, and of Wahiba al-Audali on her own veranda with her tea. She kept the observation notebook in a schoolchild's exercise book with a pale green cover. She wrote in French so a customs search would find the words of a woman at home in her cover language. She noted the general's daily walk to the second minute, his cigarette after breakfast, his cook's shopping to the Ma'ala fish market at 0740 hours on Mondays and Thursdays, his private office window lit until roughly 2200 hours on weekday nights, the sentry's relief pattern at the front gate at 0600 and 1800 hours in 2-man teams. She noted the driver's habit of leaving the annex door open in the afternoon heat and of listening to the state broadcaster's foreign language program in Russian. On September 12th, she noted the party bulletin's insertion of the retirement paragraph in a copy she borrowed from the landlord's stack. She wrote 3 words in the margin. The date is set. The 3 words traveled by way of a witting Saiyan in the Harbor Bureau to a Cyprus station cable in her handler's hand within a working week. Through October, she watched the retirement day approach. The general took his usual leave in the middle of the month at the al-Audali family land east of Aden and returned to the residence on October 24th. His son wrote to Wahiba from the Frunze Military Academy, where he was in his second year. and Wahiba read the letter to the general at supper on the veranda, and Carney noted the letter's arrival by the courier van at the corner house at 17:22 hours. His daughter, who was married in Beirut, did not write. On November 1st, the reviewing stand tarpaulin was delivered to the Ma'ala compound. On November 2nd, the guard of honor was drilled at the compound in dry runs of the release order. On November 3rd, the electrical shop van signed onto the gate ledger for the first time in the file's 90 days. By November 8th, the operation had a mission commander at Cyprus Station with the invented name Yuri Mirov and the code name Ibis, a coast operative running a Zodiac Mark IV inflatable with a 40-horsepower outboard at a fuel cache position at Bir Ali Cove, and a research division analyst in Tel Aviv with the code name Godwit, who had built the ceremony reconstruction from 4 consular reports on prior retirements at Ma'ala and from the paper trail of the reviewing stand contractor's stated method. The analyst had also written the 4 minutes of the seam into a single paragraph in an internal assessment dated November 12th. The paragraph was the operation. Every state ceremony in the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen in 1984 had a public address system, and every public address system in a state ceremony had a supplier. The supplier for the Ma'ala compound was a subdirectorate of the State Culture Ministry that owned 4 horn speakers and 1 mixing amplifier of Czech manufacture. The subdirectorate signed a general instrument to the reviewing stand contractor for each ceremony. The reviewing stand contractor was a small state-affiliated joinery in Tawaha that also did the tarpaulin, the bunting, the trestle table, and the potted date palms. The joinery in turn signed a wiring instrument to a small Ma'ala electrical shop called al-Sharq lil Kahraba on the Ma'ala front, which had held the state ceremony wiring subcontract since 1974. Al-Sharq lil Kahraba was owned by Nashwan Ali al-Sabri. He had come to Aden from Sheikh Uthman in 1962, apprenticed as a wireman under the British, taken over his master's shop in 1969, and had signed the state PA subcontract for 10 years. He had also been a witting asset of a foreign service for the last 11 of those years. He had never met the operative he was fronting for. He had never been given a name. He had been asked once every 18 months to add a Bulgarian sub-subcontractor to the shop's list of specialist attendances, with paperwork provided in Bulgarian and Arabic, and to sign the specialist onto the compound gate ledger on the day of a state ceremony. He had signed on 4 such specialists over the 11 years. None of them had been asked to return. The Bulgarian labor program was a real state-to-state instrument. Bulgarian construction and electrical firms had held contracts through the state trading enterprise Texim and later Technostroy since the middle of the 1970s. Bulgarian workers came into Aden by scheduled service from Sofia and were housed in a prefabricated compound on the Kormaksar Road at the Isthmus. Their labor permits were issued through the Labor Ministry on cursory papers. The Bulgarian consular section in Aden was small, and its officers did not attend the workers' compound. It was the cleanest foreign national cover Aden then offered a European featured operative. The specialist was Konstantin Petrov. He had entered Aden on a scheduled service from Sofia on October 10, 1984. He had presented his labor permit at the Kormaksar terminal. He had been driven to the workers' compound and shown a small room with a metal bed and a fan. He had eaten in the workers' canteen for a week to learn the crew's routines, worked a wiring job at the State Cinema in Crater, another at the Aden radio transmitter shed, and had by the 2nd week been the specialist al-Sharq lil Karaba would call for a difficult PA rewire. He was on the shop's list of specialists. He had a Bulgarian lettered overall, a canvas tool bag, and a small stack of handwritten notes in Cyrillic on the standing PA cabling at 3 previous state ceremonies. His true name was Alon Katsir. His code name was Bee-Eater. He had grown up in Rehovot. He had learned Bulgarian in a language course in Tel Aviv over 16 months in 1982 and 1983. He had spent the summer of 1984 in Varna on a student exchange under a different Bulgarian identity to walk himself into the language. He now dreamed in the language when he was tired. That morning at the workers' compound, he had dreamed in Bulgarian and had woken briefly in a small confusion of which language was to answer the room. He had answered the room in Bulgarian. He had lain still for 1 minute and then had eaten his breakfast at 0720 hours. At 15:12 hours on November 22, 1984, the small blue Peugeot 504 returned to the compound gate. Al-Sabri drove. Katsir sat in the passenger seat with his canvas tool bag on his knees. The corporal on the gate stamped the wiring docket and let them through. Al-Sabri parked at the west wall of the parade ground near the compound's generator shed. Al-Sabri stepped out. Katsir stepped out. Al-Sabri walked to the joinery's tarpaulin at the reviewing stand to speak with the foreman about the trestle table. He would not walk back. He would leave the compound on foot at 16:30 hours through the harbor gate. He would not know what had been done with the afternoon. Katsir walked to the generator shed. The shed was a small brick building against the west wall, its roof vents rusted, its door a British 1950s fitting with a single lever tumbler mortise lock. Katsir opened it in 7 seconds with a picked key he had cut in the workers' compound over the previous 3 evenings. Inside was a Perkins P 3.152 diesel engine, 3 cylinders, 2.5 liters, coupled to a 12 kilovolt amp alternator on a portable base. The engine was cold. Katsir did not touch it. He read its plate. He photographed nothing. He walked the length of the PA cabling from the shed to the 4 column-mounted horns at the corners of the parade ground. He noted the 8-meter honors dais at the front of the reviewing stand and the standing rostrum bolted to its center. He noted the potted date palms at the 4 corners of the stand, each in an unglazed clay pot. He noted the trestle table beside the rostrum where the book of duty would be signed at 21:30 hours. He noted the position of the standard-bearer's mark, chalked onto the tarmac at 10 paces off the dais. He made himself do the wiring inspection the docket said he had come to do. There was a corroded connector at the eastern horn column, and he replaced it from the tool bag with an in-period check connector from the state subdirectorate's own stock. He tightened the horn's clamp. He walked the cable trace back. He noted every distance in meters to a Ma'ala builder's tape. He wrote 7 lines of Cyrillic in the shop's ledger. He signed the ledger, K. Petrov. At 16:22 hours, with the reviewing stand tarpaulin still up, he stood for 2 minutes at the back rail of the stand and looked south across the parade ground. The barrack block on the south edge was 120 meters long, painted white, its colonnade of 8 columns already casting a long afternoon shadow. Beyond the south wall, the officers' mess with its trellised terrace looked west toward the harbor. Beyond the east wall of the compound, the shore road ran 200 meters north to the compound's east gate, the gate through which the general would leave the mess at 23:35 hours. Katsir did none of what a first-year operative would have done. He measured no sight lines, he touched no upholstery, no railing, no glass. He selected no vantage. He was not the marksman on this file. He was the man who would walk out through the compound's evening docket at 2200 hours with the joinery's van and be back inside it at 0010 hours. He walked back to the generator shed at 1640 hours. He replaced the connector spare. He locked the shed door in 3 seconds. He walked to the compound gate. The corporal on the gate stamped his docket out. He returned to the workers' compound on the Kormaksar Road at 1728 hours. He ate his supper at 1800 hours in the workers' canteen. At 1930 hours, the joinery's van collected him for the ceremony. At 2000 hours, the ceremony assembled. 240 officers and enlisted men of the Directorate of Military Intelligence and the 1st Armored Brigade stood in 3-rank formation on the parade ground under the 4 horn speakers. The reviewing stand carried the party observer, an alternate of the Central Committee, whose name would appear on the citation, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, the Soviet Senior Advisor to the General Staff, in dress uniform without ribbons in the courtesy of a foreign country's ceremony, 1 Cuban officer, 1 East German liaison, the incoming officer, Colonel Fadl Qasim al-Yafi'i, and the general. The general wore his olive-green service tunic with red-piped shoulder boards and peaked cap with red band. On his left breast, he wore the Order of the Red Star. At his right hip, he wore his Makarov PM pistol in its regulation holster. The pistol was empty. The regulation had held throughout the People's Armed Forces history and had never been amended. The holster's flap was tucked under the belt strap. He would not touch it that night. At 2040 hours, the standard of the Directorate was brought forward. It was a 2-meter staff carried by a corporal of the Standard Party. The corporal marched to the chalked mark 10 paces off the dais and stood. The party observer read the citation of the general's service. It was 9 lines. It ran to 62 seconds. It began with the enlistment of 1954 and ended with the naming of the successor. It did not mention the foreign liaison desk. At 20:44 hours, the Soviet senior advisor rose from his seat on the stand and, in Russian, delivered a courtesy tribute of 41 seconds. He spoke of the shared work of intelligence services in the anti-imperialist struggle. He wished the general the health of long years. He resumed his seat. At 21:30 hours, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence read the release order. The release order was a single paragraph. It relieved General Nasir Muhsin al-Audali from the post of head of the Directorate of Military Intelligence with effect from 00 hours, November 23, 1984. It appointed Colonel Fadl Qasim al-Yafi'i to the post, with effect from the same hour. The corporal of the Standard Party inclined the standard. The general saluted the standard. The colonel saluted the standard. The two officers turned from the dais to the trestle table, where the book of duty lay open in the light of two paraffin lamps. The general did not sign. The book of duty was for the incoming officer only. The colonel signed the book of duty. The signature took 8 seconds. From that signature onward, the Directorate of Military Intelligence was the colonel's. The pistol at the general's right hip was still empty. The aide-de-camp, Major Ali Said al-Dali'i, stood at his left shoulder. The incoming details officer, Captain Faisal Naji al-Awlaki, stood at 3 paces to the general's right rear. The 4 minutes at which no officer would legally hold the general's person were still 2.5 hours away. The ceremony was not yet over. The ceremony had already contained, in its own choreography, the physical picture of what was coming. At 2200 hours, the parade was dismissed. The 4 horn speakers went silent. The generator shed's Perkins P 3.152 engine ran on for 2 minutes past dismissal by standing procedure. It then cut. The reviewing stand's paraffin lamps were carried down by 2 enlisted men. The tarpaulin came down at 22:12 hours. The senior officers turned toward the mess. The mess at the Ma'ala compound was a 1930s trellised terrace on the south side of the barrack block. Its floor was a red and black tile in a herringbone pattern. Its ceiling was slow-turning fans of brass. Its glass was in the wooden shutters, thrown open to the trade wind. Along the terrace wall stood the standing bar with its short row of bottles. 2 of the state distillery's date liquor, 2 of Cuban rum, and, at the far end, 1 Georgian brandy from the Soviet advisor's cellar, in a bottle with a Cyrillic label. The bottle had been walked over from the advisor's compound in Kormaksar that afternoon, in a shoulder bag by an aide of the Soviet senior advisor. At 22:20 hours, the Soviet senior advisor proposed the retirement toast. The mess filled with the 12 senior officers who would be present. The general, the colonel, the deputy chief of staff for intelligence, 4 brigade commanders of the 1st Armored Brigade, 3 staff officers of the Directorate, the Cuban officer, and the East German liaison. The senior advisor poured the Georgian brandy into small, clear glasses. He raised his glass. He gave a Russian toast of 11 words. The general answered him in Russian. The general's Russian was slow but exact. The senior advisor drank once. The general drank once. He did not drink again. The party observer approached and pressed the folded citation into the general's tunic pocket. The pocket was over the Order of the Red Star. The 2 men shook hands. The alternate of the Central Committee spoke of the future work of the party in the region. The general listened. The colonel who had signed the book of duty stood 1 pace behind the aide-de-camp and did not speak. He would speak that night once, in Arabic, to the incoming details captain on the shore road at the corner house's gate. The general looked once at the wall clock at the end of the terrace. It read 22:36 hours. He looked at the aide-de-camp. The aide-de-camp inclined his head. That was their private signal. It meant they had 1 hour of the mess left. They had used it before at other ceremonies. It meant the general would take his citation, his pistol, and his cap, and he would walk home. At 23:10 hours, the incoming details captain, Captain Faisal Naji al-Awlaki, arrived at the mess terrace door with the 2 doorstep sentries of the new detail. A corporal and a private, neither older than 21. They stood at the terrace door with their AK-74 rifles across their chests in the standing formation. The corporal of the new detail was not to speak in the mess. The private of the new detail was not to speak at all. They stood. At 23:34 hours, the general set down his empty glass. The wall clock read 23:34 hours. The aide-de-camp collected the general's cap from the wooden peg beside the mess terrace door and handed it to him. The general placed the cap on his head. He walked to the terrace door. He turned once at the door to the Soviet senior advisor and nodded. The senior advisor nodded once. At 23:35 hours, the general stepped out of the mess with his aide-de-camp at his left shoulder and the incoming detail's captain 3 paces behind. The 2 doorstep sentries of the incoming detail stepped in behind the captain. The 4 men and the general walked in loose file down the mess terrace steps toward the compound's east gate. The east gate of the Ma'ala compound opened at 23:37 hours to a corporal salute. The general did not return it. He stepped through onto the shore road. His aide-de-camp stepped through at his left shoulder. The incoming detail's captain stepped through 3 paces behind. Behind the captain came the 2 doorstep sentries of the incoming detail. Behind the sentries, the corporal of the compound gate closed the gate and returned to his ledger. The shore road ran north along the harbor for 900 meters to the switchback street that climbed to 14 Ma'ala Terrace. The road at that hour carried 3 watchmen, a state security patrol vehicle stationed at the harbor bureau's east corner, and no traffic. The trade wind was north-northeast at 10 knots. The temperature was 24 degrees. The moon, a waxing gibbous just past the first quarter, was already low above the west end of the harbor. Its light lay across the water in a thin band. To the east, the plume of the little Aden refinery stacks was a slow, dark line against a slightly less dark sky. The 5 men walked in loose file at parade pace. The general walked in the center of the road. The aide-de-camp walked at his left shoulder. They did not speak for the first 300 meters. At 300 meters, the general looked once at his aide-de-camp and said, in Arabic, that he would not miss the Wednesday staff meeting. The aide-de-camp smiled once and said, in Arabic, that the colonel would miss it for him. That was the last sentence the 2 men would say to each other. They walked on. At the midpoint of the road, at 450 meters, a small blue Peugeot 504 passed the file going south toward the compound. The van's driver's door stencil read, Al-Sharq Lil Karabah. The van's headlamps were on. The general did not look at the van. The van was the joinery's evening removal of the state PA equipment on the standing paperwork of the compound's evening docket. It was collecting Konstantin Petrov from the compound at 23:45 hours. It was on time. At 600 meters, the general took a cigarette from his tunic pocket and lit it in a small cupped hand against the trade wind. The aide-de-camp did not smoke. The captain 3 paces behind did not speak. The general drew twice from the cigarette, held it in his right hand, and walked on. His Makarov PM was at his right hip in its regulation holster. It was empty. At 750 meters, the file turned inland at the switchback street. The street climbed for 150 meters in 3 switchbacks to the corner house at 14 Ma'ala Terrace. The street was narrow and had no lamp. The trade wind fell as they climbed above the shore. The state security patrol vehicle at the harbor bureau did not follow. It had no orders to follow. The retiring general's personal detail was legally the personal details, and the personal detail was walking with him. At the second switchback, at 830 meters, the 5 men came within sight of the corner house. The house showed 2 lights. The veranda lamp burned above the front gate. The private office window at the northeast corner was lit. Wahiba al-Audali was on the veranda. She could not see the 5 men yet. At 23:58 hours, the file reached the front gate of 14 Ma'ala Terrace. The 2 doorstep sentries of the outgoing detail, Corporal Salim and Private Numan, came to attention at the gate. They saluted their general, they saluted their aide-de-camp, they saluted the incoming detail's captain. Their orders had been for 1800 hours to 0600 hours. Their orders had been amended that morning to end at midnight. At 23:59 hours, the aide-de-camp Major Ali Said al-Dalii inclined his head to Captain Faisal Naji al-Awlaki. It was the courtesy handover. The aide-de-camp took 1 step to the general's left. The captain took 1 step forward to the general's right rear. The 2 doorstep sentries of the outgoing detail stepped down from the gate. Their watch was over. Their standing orders had been for their commander of 6 years. Their commander was the aide-de-camp. They fell in behind him. He turned inland to walk them back to their barracks. The 3 men stepped out of the small square of light at the veranda lamp toward the head of the switchback street. Their footfalls receded on the paving in 5 seconds. At the moment they receded, the general stood at his own front gate with the incoming captain 3 paces to his right rear and the 2 doorstep sentries of the incoming detail 3 paces behind the captain. The incoming detail had not yet stepped up to the gate. The captain's orders were to see the general to his own door and to post his sentries to the gate at that moment. He stepped forward now to see the general to his door. At 00 hours and 1 minute, the general stepped from the front gate onto the short garden path. The path was 6 paces from the gate to the veranda stair. It was 1.5 meters wide. It was flagged in a pale stone. The veranda lamp threw its light across the first 3 paces. The last 3 paces were in a soft shadow against the wall of the porch. At the second pace on the garden path, the general was passed on his left by a Bulgarian overalled figure who had come around the low side wall of the corner house from the switchback street. The figure moved at a walking pace. The figure carried a small canvas tool bag over the left shoulder. The figure inclined his head in the small courtesy of a workman moving past a senior officer at his residence. The captain, 3 paces behind, saw the figure only from behind. The joinery's van had passed the file half an hour earlier on the shore road. A workman on the switchback street at midnight was not by itself an anomaly. At the third pace, the figure was on the general's left shoulder. The general began to turn his face left toward the figure in the ordinary courtesy of a passing greeting. The figure's right hand had come out of the canvas tool bag. In the figure's right hand was a Makarov PM pistol with a suppressor of the era's Czech pattern. The pistol had been loaded in the wiring van at 23:49 hours. The safety had been off since 23:58 hours. The strike was executed in the register the file's assessments had described. The first round was placed at the base of the skull at 00 hours 2 minutes. The general fell forward without a sound and did not reach the veranda stair. The second round was placed at the crown at 00 hours 2 minutes and 11 seconds. The figure stepped over the fallen commander, walked 6 paces down the garden path away from the gate, and stepped over the low sidewall onto the switchback street at 00 hours 2 minutes and 41 seconds. The captain, 3 paces behind, had by that point seen the second round placed. He drew his own Makarov. It was, by the same regulation, empty. He shouted the alarm. His 2 sentries came forward with their AK-74 rifles across their chests. They saw the figure gone. Wahiba al-Audali stepped through her own door, onto the veranda, at 00 hours 4 minutes. She began to walk down the veranda stair. At 00 hours 10 minutes, Katzir was inside the wiring van on the Harbor Road, moving south at 40 kilometers per hour on the standing paperwork of the compound's evening docket. The residence at 14 Ma'ala Terrace was locked down at 00 hours 7 minutes. State security officers arrived in 2 civil cars at 00 hours 38 minutes. By 02 hours, the harbor master had ordered a check of the small boat berths in Tawaha. The check returned that all berths were as expected. At 03 hours 20 minutes, a Zodiac Mark IV inflatable left Tawahar's Key under a coast operative with the code name Storm Petrel. It refueled from a pre-cached drum at Bir Ali Cove and crossed south across the Gulf of Aden, 250 kilometers to French Djibouti. It entered Djibouti territorial waters at 08 hours. The state security organization's initial theory, filed at 09 hours on November 23rd, was an internal quarrel from the al-Audali tribal country. That theory held for 4 days. On November 27th, it shifted to a factional strike inside the Yemeni Socialist Party's ordinary tensions. On December 8th, a foreign service theory was raised in an internal assessment for the first time and closed a week later without conclusion. The party bulletin of December 17th carried a 9-line obituary. It did not mention the manner of death. Colonel Fadl Qasim al-Yafi'i took the directorate on the morning of November 23rd. He entered the May Allah compound the following day at 0800 hours, read the foreign liaison desk, and signed the standing agreements at 1500 hours. The desk's activity did not diminish. It also did not expand. The 4 minutes at which his own personal detail would in turn transfer in a ceremony in the same compound in 1988 would be covered by a 7-minute overlap of the outgoing and incoming details at his own front gate. The overlap was written into the amended procedure of the Yemeni People's Armed Forces on March 2, 1985, 4 months and 8 days after Operation Interlude. It is the tradecraft legacy of the seam. Alon Katsir returned to Tel Aviv on December 2, 1984. In his debriefing, he made one entry beyond the operational summary. He wrote that on the second pace of the garden path, he had inclined his head in the courtesy of a workman, and that the general had begun to turn his face to answer the courtesy. He wrote that he had not chosen the pace of that inclination, that the pace of the inclination was the pace of a workman who dreamed when he was tired in Bulgarian. Katsir took 28 days of leave and returned to duty on January 8, 1985. Wahiba al-Audali kept her house on the terrace for the rest of her life. Her son traveled from Moscow for the ceremony. Her daughter did not travel from Beirut. The Party Observer's citation folded the previous night into a tunic pocket over the Order of the Red Star, was returned to her by the Deputy Chief of Staff for intelligence at 1500 hours on November 24th. The moral question on which the file was closed at Cyprus Station was not the question of whether the strike had been justified. That question the service had answered by the assessments of 6 years. The moral question was the seam itself. From one perspective, a foreign service had ended a career that had, for 6 of 30 years, signed off on external work against its country. The arithmetic of that decision was the arithmetic of a service that must survive. The arithmetic answered itself. From the other perspective, a wife on a Ma'ala veranda had not been told her husband would not come home. A 19-year-old private on his first watch salute had lost his commander to a workman with a wiring docket. The arithmetic of that morning was a different arithmetic that answered itself in a different voice. At what point does a legal retirement stop being a legal retirement? The moment the release order is read at 21:30 hours, the moment the aide-de-camp turns inland with the outgoing sentries at 00 hours, or the moment the incoming sentries step up to a gate that has been standing empty for 4 minutes? Tell us in the comments below the exact minute you would draw that line and why. If this breakdown held your attention, subscribe to Blueprint Watch with Mark for the next operation. Share it with the one person you know who reads the procedure as the story, not the frame. And on the way out, tell us which of the seams inside a service's own written rules you would like us to open next.